This is Veronika here to talk to you about something that's very close to my heart, a topic really close to my heart, which is self-judgment. And the reason that it's so close to me, the reason that I wanted to make this video is because I found in my own relationship with myself, everything that I've been working on, for years, everything that I've struggled with, there's this pesky little thing at the very bottom of it called self-judgment. And it just seems like anything that makes me suffer, I keep finding this thing in the middle of it. And in my work as a life coach, I work with person after person. And I mean, it's devastating to see people will say that they're not smart enough, they're not skinny enough, they're not good enough around people, they're not rich enough, they're not capable enough, right? Or they'll say, oh, I'm too loud or too quiet or too emotional, too unemotional, too weak, too strong, right? And they think that it's those things, the same way that I thought, I'm too fat, I'm too awkward, I'm too this, too that, not enough this, not enough that. But at the bottom of it all, there's something so much more important. There's this pattern of self-judgment, right? And if you've ever experienced this, when you get these patterns of self-judgment that just sink their claws into you, let's say you judge yourself for being too fat, right? And then you get an eating disorder, you go on a crazy diet. Let's say you drop the weight. Let's say maybe even you defeat the odds and you keep it off. Then you just start judging something else, don't you? You just go from, okay, now I'm not going to judge my body. Now I'm going to judge my, my behaviors in social situations. I'm going to judge my ability to make money. I'm going to judge whether or not I'm close to my dreams. I'm going to compare myself to people. And it's never over, right? We just judge one thing and then we seemingly get over it and then we just move on to something else. So I hope that this video and just this conversation can start a different conversation within you about, well, what is the real problem? Like, what is self-judgment? Where does it come from? How can you begin to deal with it in a way that's more sustainable, as opposed to just dealing with what self-judgment tells you, which is that you're not thin enough, too thin, right? Instead of dealing with those things that are actually just lies that you're telling yourself, how do you begin to have compassion for yourself? And even more interestingly, how do you begin to have compassion for yourself as you do improve yourself, right? Maybe you do have some pounds to lose or some pounds to put on. How do you embark on that kind of journey of self-improvement without having self-judgment completely destroy your relationship with yourself and others? And we'll be focusing specifically on self-judgment in relation to social situations and vulnerability, and maybe both together, right? Like being vulnerable in social situations. And the reason that we're kind of focusing on those things is because self-judgment in and of itself doesn't happen in an empty room, right? And if you were to be able to have self-judgment for an hour a day and have it not affect your life whatsoever, then maybe it wouldn't be such a bad thing, right? But vulnerability and social situations, these are two things that self-judgment affects to such a fault that it affects everything else. Like if you can't be vulnerable, you can't be brave. If you can't be vulnerable, you can't get close to people. If you can't be vulnerable, then you can't know yourself. You can't achieve your dreams. If you can't interact with people in a vulnerable, authentic way, you can't ever have relationships based on something more than what your judgment tells you to be, on these rules that you set for yourself. And that can be devastating in the long run. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. And what I'm also going to try to do, which I hope I will be able to do, so hang in there with me. I would like to have a focus on the real practice of this, because I think it's really easy to write a self-help book. It's really easy to write a self-help article. It's really easy to read a self-help book or a self-help article and get all these frameworks inside of your head, get all these cliches inside of your head, like you should be your best friend, or you shouldn't judge yourself, and that If you judge yourself, that becomes projected onto others, and then you think that they're judging you. So don't judge yourself, release judgment, let it go. There's all these things that seem so simple, right? They seem so simple, but then you try to implement them, you try to apply them to your life, and it just doesn't feel like that. So I hope that the real value of what we're doing here is that I am someone that continues to struggle with this, who's on a journey with this, and I've seen enough people go through this journey to pick out some similarities in what they struggle with, what works, what doesn't work. So I hope that this can be a bridge between the theories that you might have heard about and the real everyday practice of it, because obviously you have to do the practice yourself. I cannot give you that in this video. I can't give you the perfect thing that you need to do right now. You have to figure out your own journey. But what I hope this can do is show you, you're not alone in what you experience as some of your obstacles or some of the questions that you have that might seem really strange and stupid to you, but everybody's got them. And I also hope that it can help you create your own unique way of listening to, struggling with, dealing with, coping with the self-judgment inside of your head and how that affects you as a person. So if you're ready, I hope that you're ready to embark on this journey inside of yourself, and I hope that it helps you become a better friend with yourself and that this is helpful to you. Okay, so if you're ready, let's get started. So let's begin by talking about what self-judgment is, because before we can know how to deal with it, or what little tricks we can use to help ourselves, I think we really have to sink our teeth into the essential questions, like what is it? Where does it come from? Why do we experience it differently? How is it different from other things like social anxiety, for example? How's it different from that? And why does it look different for one person as opposed to another person? And to begin with what self-judgment really is, I think it seems obvious, but it bears repeating that self-judgment is the act of looking at your own behaviors, looking at your own thoughts, looking at your own emotions, and then calling them good or bad, passing judgment on them. That's really what judgment is about, acceptable or unacceptable, good or bad, right? And self-judgment is not inherently this terrible plague. It's actually a really natural outgrowth of something absolutely amazing called self-awareness. And I'm a big fan of self-awareness. So self-judgment comes so naturally out of that. Think about it. As human beings, we have the ability to look at our own behaviors, to look at our own emotions, to look at our own thoughts, and we also have the ability to change those behaviors, those emotions, those thoughts. And then we also have the ability to judge things as good or bad. So it's really not a stretch for us to begin to judge ourselves for not being able to change those behaviors that we perform, right? It's just such a natural thing. It's natural, but it is dangerous. And if you can begin to look at self-judgment the same way that we look at something like cigarettes or cocaine, right? When these things first came out, the doctors were prescribing them. The doctors were doing them. It was everywhere. Everybody thought, this is okay, right? This is okay. We're all going to do it. But as we begin to look deeper into some of the effects that these things have on our lives, on our actual experience of life, then we begin to see, okay, maybe we don't want to smoke the cigarettes, do the cocaine. So that's what self-judgment is like. It has come to us naturally, and at first it seems so useful. It really does. It seems like it's a way to motivate yourself, and maybe it's a way that someone else has used to motivate you, right? To motivate you to change, motivate you to do things differently, and it comes as this blessing in disguise, right? But it's not, right? There's a disguise of a blessing, and then underneath that, there's a huge danger. There's just this toxic pattern that's waiting to unleash itself upon you. So that's what this is all about. It's about taking self-judgment, which is a natural outgrowth of self-awareness, unchecked, unconscious self-awareness, which seems like sort of an oxymoron, but it's really not. So to defeat that is not to squash it or attack it or remove it completely, is to come back to the roots of what is self-judgment about? Okay, it's about self-awareness, right? It's about looking at ourselves and how we look at ourselves and what we think when we look at ourselves and what we think when we look at ourselves looking at ourselves. So taking self-judgment into your own hands and coping with it is really about taking that process back into your own hands and taking charge of your own self-awareness and becoming empowered in the way that you deal with it, because it's going to happen anyway, right? So if we think about where it comes from, I've already mentioned it may come from the way that someone has spoken to you, but I really want to point out that it's not as simple as you get judged by others, you begin to judge yourself, right? There's also a very specific way that self-judgment develops that maybe you haven't noticed before. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I've gone through just so you can see how embarrassed I've been, and you can also maybe see some similarities in those stories and how it develops. When I was a kid, I hear from my grandparents, I was fearless, I would just go up to people and have no fear about what I was going to say or what I was going to do, and I would just be silly and wild, right? But when we came to Canada, when I was 8 years old, my family immigrated to Canada from the Ukraine, and everything was different. So Eastern European culture is very different, or at least Russian culture is very different from Canadian culture in one very specific way that was very painful for me. There's a lot of social pleasantries that go on in Canadian culture. You're supposed to be polite, you're supposed to be nice, you're supposed to, laugh at jokes that maybe aren't so funny, keep your mouth shut at certain things. While in my culture, when you meet somebody, if they have a big nose, the nicest thing that you could possibly say to them is, hey, you have a big nose, because that encourages intimacy between people. There's this brutal honesty just embedded in my family and all my family's friends, just where I come from. And that's how I was when I was a kid, and it didn't work. I remember this is a very embarrassing story, just so you know, embarrassment coming. In grade 3, which was right when I immigrated here to Canada, the first day, I think, we had recess, and there was this boy, and he was just making fun of this girl, and she said, oh, stop it, and then he was, I'm not really quite sure what he was doing, pulling her pigtails or something like that. And so I, with my thick Russian accent, wanting to get involved in the merrymaking that was going on here, turned to the boy and say, you'd better stop or I shove duster in your mouth. And everybody just goes silent, right? Because it makes no sense. And by duster, I meant like rag. I'm going to shove a rag in your mouth, as in to shut you up. You'd really have to have grown up the way I grew up to understand why this was funny. And no one thought it was funny. So I think this experience, I'm not really sure if that's exactly where it began, but I see that as a formative experience where I was not a self-judging organism, right? My parents may have judged me, maybe my grandparents did, maybe other kids did, but I was free to say whatever it was that was on my mind, to just be vulnerable, to just interact with people however I wanted to. And then I get this silence, this punishing silence, which appeals to me in a biological way, right? Like, biologically speaking, it's just not good to be surrounded by 10 or 12 disappointed faces all passing judgment on you and feeling like an outcast, and then people saying, what did you say? That's weird, you're weird. And then I became more sensitive to it, right? I became more sensitive to these comments that people began to say. I became sensitive to the fact that I was always the last kid picked for sports teams. Sometimes I wasn't even picked at all. If there was an odd number of people, there was just, okay, time to play, and I would never get chosen. And these things sort of built up on top of each other. And up until that point, up to a certain point at least, the self-judgment only came after, because the feedback only came after, right? So I was free of the self-judgment before, I was free of the self-judgment in the situation, right? Like, think of me shoving a duster in your mouth, right? Like, I just said whatever came to my mind. And then through enough situations where afterwards I get this really punishing response from people, Then I begin to go to the second level of self-judgment, which is when you judge yourself before something is about to happen. And this is so natural, right? Your mind learns about these situations that produce this pain of rejection, this pain of being the outcast. Your mind reacts to them because you're having this emotional reaction that's so negative, and your mind just rushes to your heart's rescue, right? It comes and it says, why did this happen? Why did this happen? And then you begin to deduce these similarities. And unfortunately for me, the similarities were social situations and saying whatever came to my mind, right? So now I've got this second stage of self-judgment where it's happening afterwards. Every time I walk away from a social situation, I'm replaying it over in my head saying, oh my God, what did I say? What did I do? And then now every time I'm about to enter into any kind of contact with people, I get this chronic self-judgment inside of my head, right? And then if you do that for long enough, you reach the third level, right? Where you're getting it after, you're getting it before, and then you're getting it during. And maybe you get it during to such an intensity that you stop entering into those situations. And this is how it went for me. So it didn't just translate into social anxiety, it translated into making mistakes. And also Eastern European culture, it's like if you get 97% on a test, it's like, where's the other 3%? So I became so averse to making mistakes. And every time that I did a test or anytime I did anything, it's like, did I make a mistake? Did I make a mistake? And before it, you just go nuts. And then during it, and some of that became sort of controllable for me. But over the long run, when it came to vulnerability, when it came to showing up with people and literally just saying whatever was in my head, there was never any positive rewards that came from that, right? So with the test, I had managed to somehow experience this anxiety afterwards, experience the anxiety beforehand, experience the anxiety during, but then I would get the tests back and sometimes the grades would be good. So the pattern was not as strengthened as it was for how it was in social situations where every time there was a negative reaction afterwards. And even if the people didn't react in a negative way, which would have been a miracle, because once you get to that third stage of anxiety where you're getting self-judgment after, before, and during, you're acting really awkward, like you're being really awkward. So it's going to be a rare occurrence if people don't treat you like you're being awkward. But let's say that you do find somebody that is just so open to you, right? Somebody that doesn't care about how awkward you're being. They just accept you unconditionally and, laugh at your silly jokes and think it's all okay. Even if you make it through all that, afterwards, you're still going to judge yourself because that's where it started, right? Where it started is going to be the hardest to remove. So it goes after, before, during. So even if you make it through all of those things, you still can never get a positive outcome of judging yourself through a social situation, right? So then you're stuck. And how this continues to move forward, the evolution of this kind of behavior is that you begin to layer self-judgment in all the different situations. So now instead of just judging yourself, you begin to judge yourself for judging yourself, which is just a very famous outcome of reading self-help books, right? Because you read about self-judgment, or maybe you read these inspiring stories by people who have overcome self-judgment, and then you think, well, why can't I do it? I must be stupid. I must be stupid because I can't overcome my thoughts of being stupid. I must be really flawed if I can't overcome my judgment of my self-judgment. And then when it starts to get really bad, you start getting judgment for the judgment for the judgment, and then you just think, I'm just in a whole whackload of mess. And what often happens when it's really serious is that you literally avoid all of those situations. You avoid social situations, you avoid vulnerability, you avoid ever taking a risk, you avoid ever making a mistake. And no matter where you are along that gradient, right, it's just a pattern. It's a pattern that becomes more efficient over time. So the more that you've practiced it, the more practiced you are at it. And the longer that you've been practicing self-judgment for, let's say you've been practicing it for like 20 or 30 years, I mean, that's a really embedded pattern. That's really strong. And it's not going to go away overnight. And that might sound sort of not encouraging, but at the same time, I think that's the first step that we can take to not judging ourselves for judging ourselves for judging ourselves, is realizing this took time to build, and self-compassion is going to take time to build. It's a pattern, it has clear stages. You can see them if you were to watch them happening to people. If you were to be able to see what I see, see various people's stories and see how this pattern looks on different people, you would see, wow, it has nothing to do with the person. It has nothing to do with the person's worth. It has nothing to do with how lovable, valuable, amazing they are. It's just a pattern. It's a pattern, and it takes over. It's like the flu, right? And there are things that we can do about it if we can be patient with ourselves, right? So that kind of brings us to the question of, why does it look different on different people? And what's really the difference between something like, I mentioned social anxiety. I had really bad social anxiety. So what's the difference between social anxiety and self-judgment? So self-judgment is kind of like the basest variable in a lot of kinds of suffering. So if you look at social anxiety, you cannot have social anxiety without self-judgment. I mean, if you weren't judging yourself in some sort of way, then you wouldn't have social anxiety. However, you can have self-judgment without having it develop into social anxiety. Okay, so you can have the difference between self-judgment and shame is the same, right? You cannot have shame without self-judgment. Self-judgment is at the bottom of that. However, you can have self-judgment without having shame. So self-judgment shows in all these different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to turn into social anxiety. It doesn't necessarily have to turn into a pattern of not taking risks, right? And being held back from that. It doesn't necessarily have to turn into, for example, resentment towards other people or anger. It doesn't have to turn into an eating disorder. It doesn't have to turn into an addiction. But the point is that it turns into something. It turns into something different for everybody. And I'll touch a little bit on why, although it's not terribly relevant why, but I think that there's an element of self-forgiveness that comes once we see, okay, I didn't choose this very consciously, right? So once you learn that pattern of self-judgment from wherever you learn it from, right? You do something, you get judged for it, you learn from it, you take it on. Then however it is that pattern plays out for you is totally unconscious. I mean, if you look back at the patterns of your past, if you try to break it down, kind of like how I've broken it down for you, this is my earliest memory of this pattern really beginning to take hold. And these are my memories of what reinforced, I guess, that belief that there was something wrong with me, right? But also became part of this pattern of looking at myself and saying, no, you're bad, you're wrong, this is bad, this is wrong. Right? If you can begin to kind of look at those patterns, you'll see that a lot of the input, a lot of the feedback was completely out of your control, right? It came from the people around you, it came from the world around you, it came from the way that certain people, certain things reacted to you. And if you had been accidentally dropped into another environment, into another setting, you would have gotten different sets of feedback. But let's say that you still developed self-judgment because your self-judgment was a byproduct of the way that your parents spoke to you, which made you more sensitive to other kinds of judgment from the rest of the world. You may have turned out to have a completely different manifestation of that exact same pattern, if that makes sense, right? So some of us are walking around judging our bodies constantly. Some of us are walking around judging our behaviors constantly. And what I find to be so interesting is that although it looks so different what we're judging, the judgment itself has very clear patterns in people. And when a person who judges themselves, let's say for being fat, looks at another person who judges themselves for not being funny enough, for example, most of the time they can't empathize, and they don't empathize. Right? The person that judges their own body just looks at the person that thinks that they're not funny and says, wow, you're really freaking out about that. Like, you really take that way too seriously. And the person that thinks that they're not funny and that's really, really serious to them looks at the person who judges their body and says, well, we've got nothing to be worried about. Like, I don't understand why you think this is such a problem. I've got real problems. So I think that's a really important thing to realize. If you feel like you're struggling with this alone, realize that you're not alone, but you may be the only person in your immediate surrounding whose self-judgment manifests in the way that yours manifests. But that doesn't mean that the core of it is not present there for other people. So maybe you can begin to think about that. Think about the people in your life and realize that everybody has the capacity for self-judgment, right? For some people can cope with it better than others. Some people have it more seriously than others. But look at somebody who's close to you that's suffering in some sort of way and begin to try to trace the roots of self-judgment within their suffering and begin to try to empathize with that process. What would it be like to have that specific flavor of self-judgment, right? Maybe think of your parents. Think of how they must have judged themselves. What was the big, scary pattern of judgment for them, right? And then begin to look at that and kind of try it on. Taste it. Taste what their self-judgment might have tasted like. And I think once you begin to do this with the people you meet, maybe with the people you interact with over the next few days, if you see any elements of suffering, anything that they're upset about, anything that they're struggling with, try to trace any origins of self-judgment in there. And I think you'll find that very interesting because, self-judgment is like a seed, but you just don't know what seed it is. It's like an egg, but what does the egg turn into? And these things look so different for people that we end up being isolated in our different manifestations when really we're all suffering from the very same thing. And I find that to be profoundly sad, but also such an opportunity, right? Such an opportunity. I think if you can begin to look at your problems, look at your suffering, look at all the things that you're going through, and see self-judgment as the origin in yourself, that can bring you such an incredible amount of healing with yourself, but also imagine how much compassion it could give you for others. Imagine how many people you could help and affect just by perceiving the problem that way, right? So that's us talking about what self-judgment is, where it comes from. I mean, I could talk about this all day, but I think we should move on to how we can begin to cope with it. What are some of the frameworks that we can use in our head? How can we implement this kind of theoretical knowledge of, self-judgment is bad for you, it hurts you. There are like these patterns that take you over. How can we begin to apply that to our own lives so that we don't have to suffer more and more every year, having these patterns get even bigger hold on us, avoid social situations, avoid vulnerability. So that's what we're going to be talking about next. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how to deal with self-judgment. So this section is actually going to be a little bit different from the next one. And in the next section, I'll cover some tips and tricks and some kind of practical applications that have worked for me, that I've seen work for other people, just some ideas that you can get for how to actually address these problems right in the moment, some tactics. But this section is actually very different from that. This is all about how you would select those tactics, how you would create tactics for yourself, and how you would arrange your mind in such a way that the tactics can be replaceable. Because when it comes down to it, even if I were to tell you in great detail what I am doing right now for all of the different manifestations of self-judgment that affect me, then by the time you watch this video, then those might have all changed, right? Because my tactics change constantly, right? And not willingly. I mean, I'm not purposefully saying, oh, okay, I don't like this one, I'll just interchange another one. But you know from your own journey, things get old, things stop working, circumstances change, right? Things happen in the world, and then a different word begins to trigger you, or a different situation begins to trigger you, and then you have a different manifestation of it. You move to a different place, you start interacting with different people, there's like these different situations that you interact with, so your tactics are going to have to be interchangeable. And that's really the key, because you can read so many self-help books, so many articles that give you these perfect tactics that work for you, and then they wear off, right? And you don't want to plunge back into a bath of self-loathing and go back to the same inefficient patterns, when those tactics wear off, you want to be able to expect those tactics to wear off, right? And then use new ones. So this section is a little bit about how you can do that. And these guidelines, and I've come up with 7 of them, they're kind of universal for dealing with self-judgment. So unlike the tactics that we'll be discussing in the next section, which can wear off, will wear off, right? It's like a favorite song. You can't like a song as much as the first time that you heard it for the rest of your life. Your relationship with that song is going to change, but you could be really into listening to music for the rest of your life. So this is what section is about. It's about how to love music, how to approaching self-judgment. So the first thing, most important thing, this is so important, I can't possibly emphasize how important this is to identify self-judgment as the problem. Because in that moment when you're all emotional, you've got the blinders on, you've been triggered, right? You're in the situation, you've been triggered, someone's looked at you that way, or you catch a certain glance of yourself in the mirror, you get a performance evaluation back, your mother speaks to you in that tone. Once the self-judgment comes on, the problem appears to be that you are an awful person, that you're ugly, that you're dumb, that you're never going to be good enough. That's what it appears the problem is. The problem appears to be your relationship with this person or money or your kids. But really, self-judgment is the problem. So this is so important. In the moment, being able to reroute your mind from focusing on all of these manifestations of the self-judgment to redirect away from saying, oh, I suck at this and I suck at that and I'll never be good at this and I'll never be good at that. Catch yourself and say, whoa, I'm doing this self-judgment thing. And in the grand scheme of things, every day as you're working on this, say, I am working on my self-judgment. That's what I'm working on. This is my goal. I am seeing self-judgment as the problem and the goal and the obstacle. This is what is at the root of it all. And it's obviously much easier said than done, right? Because when those blinders come on, you're going to err on the side of routine. So if you've gotten into the routine of believing every single self-judging thought that goes through your head and immediately embarking on a process to correct it, right? Like you get a thought about, oh my God, my love handles, and then you go and you take some diet pills. If you've been doing that for 20, 25, 30 years, that's what's embedded in there, right? So realize that identifying self-judgment as the problem works on multiple levels. So it's the problem within the grand scheme of things, but even as you're in the situation, you judge yourself, you find yourself, halfway into whatever toxic behavior you take whenever you engage in self-judgment. At that moment, when you notice, self-judgment will come back, and then you'll start judging yourself like, oh, look at you, judging yourself. And at that moment, it's important to identify self-judgment as the problem too, right? To realize that that is what's happening. And there are many layers. As I said before, you can have self-judgment, you can have self-judgment for self-judgment, you can have self-judgment for your self-judgment of your self-judgment, right? Like there's so many layers to it, and every single step of the way, the only way out, the only way to begin to claw your way out is to redirect yourself from looking at whatever it is that you're judging yourself for as the problem to seeing self-judgment as the problem. And the ways that you can do this for yourself, there are so many, right? There are so many tactics that can help you identify self-judgment as the problem, as opposed to believing your self-judging thoughts about what the problems are. But at the very heart of those tactics, there is the one very simple, very important practice of continuing to redirect your mind onto, this is what we're working on. This is what self-judgment is, what we're working on. That is what we're working on at the heart of it all, okay? And number 2 has to do with expectations. This one is really funny because everybody does this. Everybody that I've ever helped with their self-judgment journey, obviously myself included, we expect it to stop, right? And this might happen to you after you've stopped watching this video. We expect that just because we've had an epiphany, or just because we found a new tactic, or because we've learned something, or because maybe we've lost a few pounds, whatever it is that our expectation is based around, we formulate this expectation that the self-judgment won't come. And think about how absolutely ludicrous that is. If every single time that you have had a social interaction in the past 10 years, for example, let's say that you don't get self-judgment before or during. Let's say that yours only comes after, okay? So every time you enter that situation, you say, oh, okay, it's going to be okay. And then, you get excited beforehand, you get into that social situation with that person, and then you walk away, and then you judge yourself. You just beat yourself up for it. If you walk away every single time beating yourself up, and then beating yourself up for beating yourself up because you said, okay, well, last time I had a conversation with a person, I promised myself that I would talk less, or that I wouldn't interrupt, or that I would smile more, or that I would talk more, and I didn't. Oh, God, I'll have to do this next time. And then you set yourself up for next time fixing all of those things that you outlined, and therefore you expect the self-judgment not to come because you have changed all the things that you told yourself to change, even though it's been consistently coming for 10 years. That is just crazy. Think about how crazy that is. It has been coming, okay? So expect it to come. And this, for me, has been a source of such peace. I mean, I can't even tell you. To expect reality is the way that you begin to deal with reality. Having these expectations that you're going to find just that one more book and then it'll fix it forever. That you'll lose just 10 more pounds and then it'll fix it. Once you get to a certain dollar amount and then you get that perfect partner and then you get that perfect body, the self-judgment will go away. It will not. Okay? Self-judgment, even if you reach some sort of impossible state of your fairy godmother comes and you reach some sort of impossible state of perfection in all of those areas of your life, you can be assured that unless you wish for your fairy godmother to help you cope with your self-judgment, you will begin to judge something else. Okay? Like, remember, number one, self-judgment is the problem. And if it doesn't manifest in one way, it will manifest in another. So the most reasonable, self-compassionate, loving thing that you can do is expect reality. Expect what has been happening to continue to happen. And then at least you have removed from yourself that really painful process of beating yourself up for failing to meet your own expectations again, right? You have this expectation of perfection from yourself, you fail yourself, and then you judge yourself, right? So at least you can remove that portion of it by expecting reality. Now that's very different from saying, this is how I always want things to be. I never want to improve. I never want to work on these behaviors. And I think sometimes we confuse acceptance of what's really happening for pointing it out as an archetype for what should always happen. No, acceptance is kind of like entering your starting location on your GPS. If you have this delusional idea about where you are right now, and then you put in where you want to go, it doesn't matter. The GPS will not take you there, right? You need to have your starting location be accurate in order to get anywhere. So the sooner that you can begin to expect what has been happening to happen, the sooner you can have a plan prepared. You can begin to plan out, okay, this is what's going to happen, and this is how I'm going to deal with it, right? If every single time you interact with people, this happens to me almost every single time, when I have a really long, drawn out, really vulnerable conversation with somebody, I will judge myself afterwards. Like, this happens to me, even after I finish making this video, right? Like, before I do something creative, I get in this state of, oh, what can I create? How can I make it better? What can I say? And then after I finish making it, if I continue to think those thoughts, how can I make it better? What can I say? And that turns into the self-judgment, right? Because I can't change what I've done and said at that point. So for me to expect anything different to happen is just pure suffering. And then to judge myself for the fact that it happens is just pure suffering. So I liberate myself by allowing for the possibility of it, expecting it, and having a plan for when it comes. Okay? Number 3, also very important, I guess they're all very important, is to not listen to self-judgment when it tells you to stop engaging in vulnerability and social situations or whatever other, I mean, that's what we're focusing on, but if there is anything else that, like taking risks, for example, if there's anything else that your judgmental thoughts consistently tell you to do, like don't talk to people or move away to the mountains, right? Like anything that the thoughts tell you to do in order to avoid the self-judgment, because it's gotten to this point where you've judged yourself after, you've judged yourself before, you're judging yourself during, and the thoughts tell you stop getting into those situations, stop being vulnerable, stop getting into those social situations, stop chasing your dreams, stop risking money, stop doing all these things that are causing these thoughts to happen, right? So this comes back to self-judgment is the problem, right? Don't listen to self-judgment when it tells you that social situations are the problem, vulnerability is the problem. Don't let it stop you, because something very dangerous happens when those thoughts tell you this is happening because of vulnerability or because of interacting with people, and you need to stop that. Just by listening to those thoughts and acting on them, you make that process more efficient, right? And every single time that you believe those thoughts become stronger, right? It's like you're feeding them. Every single time that you believe them and act on what they say, you make them stronger. Every single time that you don't feed them and you just observe them and you don't do what they say, you make them weaker. Both paths totally painful, excruciatingly painful. It's painful both ways, right? But to make those thoughts stronger in the long run is going to be much more toxic for you than to weaken them. So make sure that you don't do what they say. Continue to expose yourself to those situations and work on self-judgment. Expect self-judgment to come and work on the self-judgment. Do not stop getting into those situations that trigger it. Number 4. Oh, this is so good. This one's so important. I mean, they're so important. I want you to imagine that every single judgmental thought that you put on yourself is like a brick, okay? So you're just lying there on the floor, and every time that you put a judgment on yourself, it's like a brick that you cover yourself with. And think about how different it is for you to act out of just being free, being able to move your body about as you want to, as opposed to being having a pile of bricks on top of you. It is really difficult to do anything with a pile of bricks on top of you. So if you are layering on a pile of bricks onto yourself unconsciously, because remember, these processes are embedded, they're unconscious, right? Right now, it's so unconscious. You just put it on a layer of self-judgment. When you're done with that, you put on a layer of self-judgment on top of that layer of self-judgment. You're just unconsciously piling it onto yourself. And then you're piling on even more for your inability to be free, to be authentic, to be happy underneath this pile of bricks, right? So nobody can function under a pile of bricks, right? So the key there is whenever you get that awareness, whenever, right? Maybe you get it when you have just a few bricks on top of you. Maybe you get it when you're already under the mound, right? Whenever you notice that there's a brick in your hand, you put it down, okay? The last link is what you do. You put it down. So this part is really about control. What we always try to control is, okay, I'm not going to let the self-judging thoughts come. Impossible. I'm not going to react to them every single time that it comes. Impossible. Okay? That's not what you get to work on. What you get to control, your entire locus of control, is the last thing that happens. So there's this unconscious pattern, and it's going along, and it's going along. Whenever you develop awareness, right? That's when you get to add something on. You get to add compassion. You don't get to remove the judgment, right? You don't get to make that entire thing stop happening. You don't get to remove the judging thoughts from your head, right? That's the last thing that happens. The thoughts come into your head. They trigger those emotions. They trigger more thoughts, trigger more thoughts. The only thing you can do right now is catch yourself, add compassion, put the brick down. Catch yourself putting the bricks on, put the brick down. Catch yourself judging yourself, put it down, add compassion, right? The last link. And this is really, you know, when they say, like, you don't control what happens, you know, you only control your reactions to it. This is, I think, where people get kind of confused, because self-judgment is a reaction, right? Like something happens outside of you, and then you react to it with self-judgment. So then you think, okay, I should be able to control that. But really what that cliche is about is that you don't get to control the first part or the first 10 parts of any given life process. You get to control the last part. That's where you get your choice. And then over time, you trust that that process pulls back. And I guarantee you that is exactly how it happens. You know, I was so drowning in self-judgment when it came to social situations. And first, I started noticing how in the moment, I would hyper focus on my limbs. I would hyper focus on my words. What am I saying? What am I doing? And I would just take a moment and I would breathe and I would kind of put all my attention back into my heart and I would say, you know what? I'm just going to do it. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to do it. And when self-judgment comes afterwards, I'll deal with it afterwards. But right now, I'm just going to do it. Enough times of showing up like that in the moment, I learned to be able to do it. However, so that's better, right? I'm better. But I was still doing it before and after. Right. And then slowly before, I developed some tactics to deal with it before by expecting it, identifying it as the problem. Right. I would get into this unconscious pattern of worrying and getting anxious and judging myself beforehand. And I would catch myself and I would say, you know what? I'm not going to put myself under a pile of bricks, because if there's the worst thing that I could possibly do for myself as I'm about to go in public and talk to people, go on a stage and talk to people, is cover myself in self-judgment. Right. So I catch myself, I put the brick down. Maybe I take a few bricks off, right? Doing that consistently. Now I'm at the point where I do vulnerable things, I get into social situations. Afterwards, I get this 5 to 10 minute buzz. That's kind of like my normal right now. Maybe by the time you're watching this video, maybe you're watching it a year later. Maybe that's not my normal anymore, right? Maybe I don't get that 5-10 minutes at the end, but that's where I am. You know, you pull it back slowly. You don't judge the process. You pull it back slowly by adding compassion to the end. You don't try to remove the judgment, expect it not to come, kill it, thwart it, none of that. Whenever you notice, just realize, oh my gosh, I'm judging myself. That is what is happening. That is the problem. I accept that that is happening. I put the brick down. I'm not going to put any more judgment on. I'm not going to judge myself for holding this brick. I'm not going to judge myself for how many bricks are on top of me, okay? Oh my gosh, I'm holding this brick. I'm hurting myself. That's sad, I don't want to do that. Okay, I'm going to put the brick down. I don't deserve that, okay? And enough times of doing that, you'll realize sooner, you do it more automatically, you do it in more situations, but it's still a journey, right? So add compassion to the end, right? Don't try to stop it in the beginning. Don't try to stop it halfway. Whenever you develop that awareness, that is when you have the opportunity. And just forget about judging. How long did it take you to become aware? How long did it take you to notice? What stupid things did you do before you noticed? What you said, what you did, who was there? Forget it, okay? You notice yourself holding the brick, put the brick down. Add some compassion. This is happening. It's been happening. It's okay, okay? Catching yourself is the right thing to do, right? So if you've caught yourself, you've put the brick down, just one brick, you've done a good job, okay? And tell yourself that you've done a good job, okay? Now, something else that's really important, now number 5, is creating a safe space. Because you might think, okay, this sounds really nice, and putting the brick down sounds really nice, but you might try it a few times, right? And you put the brick down, and then you just pick it right back up. Right? You put it down, and you pick 3 back up. You just can't seem to help yourself. So the most important thing after you put the brick down is to give yourself a safe space to unload those bricks. Okay, so as soon as you kind of caught yourself, you've put the brick down, you've done a good job, it's time to unload all of that pressure that's on you, right? Because if you can imagine authenticity, happiness, joy, laughter, all of those good feelings that you want, they're basically going to naturally happen if you don't have any bricks on you. Okay, so you don't need to reach for these things as if they're somewhere over there, right? You just need to work on, well, first of all, not trying as hard as you can not to put the bricks on yourself, but then also realizing, okay, there's bricks on me, I'm gonna remove them. No judgment, just gonna remove them. And that's something that you do in a safe space. Okay, so that happens after you, at the very end, you add compassion, and it's not that you're undoing what you've done to yourself, right? You're just engaging in another part of the cycle. So if you're currently in a cycle of adding judgment on yourself over and over and over and over, and then you have so much on you that you're suffering, you're suffocating, and you burst it out, You know what I'm talking about, right? You burst out, and then after you burst out, you feel better. Oh, I'm so authentic now. I feel so much better, but you got drunk, but you yelled at your kids, right? But you did all these things, and then you just start judging yourself for how you burst out, and the cycle starts again. Okay, so here's what's important, right? You stop putting the bricks on yourself, but then you make a plan to unload all those bricks off of you. So ideally, you could do this by yourself, right? That would be absolutely amazing if you could just catch yourself putting the bricks on, and you could just give yourself that space and unload brick by brick, okay? And let go of that, just vent all of your emotions out, get to this place where you've kind of unloaded everything that you've thought, everything that's happened. Maybe journal it out or scream it out or cry it out, right? Crying is just about my favorite thing ever, right? So unloading all those things by yourself, that is absolutely amazing. And it's cool to want to do that, but this is where we come back to expectations. If right now you consistently, if you try doing what I'm talking about right now, and if you consistently are unable to give yourself a safe space, don't judge yourself for that. Okay? You need a safe space. To deny yourself a safe space because you're judging yourself for not being able to give it to yourself, that's self-judgment too. Okay? And there's so many ways for you to create a safe space. If you feel unable to do it by yourself right now, and you need somebody to support you while you're going through, undoing these patterns of self-judgment, learning self-compassion, pulling that process back so that it's not in every single part of every single interaction layered on top of one another. Maybe there's a friend you can reach out to. Maybe there's a partner. Maybe maybe you get a life coach, maybe you get a therapist, right? There are so many ways to create a safe space, and there are so many excuses that you could possibly make to yourself about not doing it. Oh, I don't have enough money, or I should be able to do it myself. I should be able to have enough time. But at the end of the day, there are enough free services available. If you can't do it yourself right now, then there's nothing that you can do about that. And if it really means something to you, you got to find the time, because if you don't deal with this, how much time are you going to be able to enjoy in your life? How much time are you really going to have here, right? You can think of a million excuses, but that doesn't change the fact that you need the safe space, and you need it now. It is so important to have a safe space, and it is so easy to judge yourself for all the reasons that you can't give it to yourself right now, okay? So just realize this is also, you'll see this theme recurring, not just as we're talking here, but just as you are dealing with your own special brand of self-judgment, this theme of realize what's real right now. You got to accept what is here in order to move forward. If what is here is an inability right now, just for now, not always, right? Just an inability to provide a safe space for yourself, then create that safe space elsewhere, okay? So that you can one day create that safe space with yourself. I see that happening all the time. And don't let your mind tell you that you'll become dependent on this person. You won't be able to do it by yourself, right? Anybody that's going to facilitate you creating a safe space for yourself is just going to show you, wow, this feels good, right? And the more that you can feel that with a person, like, oh my gosh, I'm get an emotional release, and then it feels good. I can cry and it feels good. I get this space to feel my feelings, it unloads, I don't hurt anybody, and then it makes me feel better. You will naturally begin doing that in and out of those helping situations with the person, okay? This will happen naturally. Don't worry. Create that safe space now that you have clarity right now. Don't wait for when you're triggered and you're anxious and you're judging yourself and you say, where's my safe space? And then you judge yourself for not having it. You judge the people around you for not giving it to you. Like, no, now when you have clarity, make a plan for, who is my safe space? Where will I go for this safe space? Is there anybody in my environment right now? If there's not, don't judge them. Don't judge yourself. Go somewhere, get a professional, make that safe space happen for you. It's so essential. Okay. Now, moving on to number 6. This has to do with what you're doing right now to keep yourself from seeking this safe space and developing awareness. And I call these crutches. You may have heard me use that word before. But this is basically a way that you deal with your emotions that does not facilitate you to independently one day let go of your emotions. Okay, so if you say you hire a professional or you access a free counseling service, for example, and you vent your emotions with that person in order to facilitate the feeling of safety of venting your emotions, then in the long run, there is a road to independence, right? That person can support you. And then in the long run, you can learn to support yourself. Maybe you do it with your spouse, right? They do it for you, and then maybe you do it for them. There's a journey here, you can, in the long run, that can become a journey of independence, right? But if every single time that you reach this pile of bricks on top of you and you don't know how to get out, if every single time that happens, you go and you drink, you go and you smoke pot, you go and you party, you go and you watch TV, or you go and you do these things that require this kind of a vice element in order to do it for you, then you won't learn in the grand scheme of things, right? Like, that is a crutch that allows you to unload all these bricks off of yourself, sure, but it keeps you from learning to do it yourself because you're more than capable. And it really reinforces behind the scenes, obviously, subconsciously, it really reinforces this idea that you can't do it, right? If you have to smoke pot to do it, then every single time that you do, this idea is reinforced in the back of your head, like, see, I can't do it myself. This drug can do it for me. I can't do it myself. Right? And I think this is where some self-help devices, some tactics actually get kind of dangerous. I think that it's more than okay to sit down and listen to a hypnosis CD, listen to a meditation. I do those things. I'm sure you do those things. Do all of these things that work as these crutches that help you. They help you while like, what are crutches supposed to do, right? Like, if you break your leg, they help you walk. Like, it's okay to use those crutches. But if those crutches are the only way that you ever do that, right? If there's no way for you to get self-support in an empty room, to support yourself, to love yourself, to give yourself compassion without any third-party tools, if there's no future for that, then it's going to be really difficult for you to cope with future situations, right? I'm not saying that all the things that I've mentioned are like inherently wrong. It's not inherently wrong to listen to hypnosis CD or, like, who am I to judge if people smoke pot, right? But if that's the only way, then what happens when you don't have that thing, right? So it's kind of like learning to cook is what I see it as. You can go to as many restaurants as you want, right? But knowing how to cook at home for yourself, by yourself, that's really important, right? That's how you can control the nourishment that your body needs, interact with the nourishment that your body needs. So a big part of this process is identifying some of those crutches and giving yourself the opportunity to kind of try to swim without them. Give yourself the opportunity to take off the training wheels, take off the floaters, give yourself the opportunity to get that balance on your own without relying on the substance, without relying on the addiction, on the vice, on whatever it is that you're currently depending on in order to manage your emotions for you, right? And go slowly. It's okay. You don't have to like go cold turkey off of everything. But I think it's important to keep that goal in mind long term, that not only do I identify self-judgment as the problem and as the journey, right? Accept the journey for what it is and expect it to happen, pull back, add the compassion at the end, create the safe space for myself. In that, I will also pull back on all the ways that I am interfering with that journey from happening organically, naturally, all of these third-party elements and crutches that I'm putting into it, okay? So now we're at number 7, and this is about experimentation, okay? And this is kind of what I was saying at the beginning, but I will say it again because it's something that will keep coming up for you if you've been searching for the right answer, like the solution to self-judgment. the solution to self-judgment is self-awareness. Self-awareness is a process of curiosity, experimentation. It is a process. It is not a tactic. It is not a thing. It doesn't look any specific way. It can look a million ways. Just like self-judgment can take on all these different forms, self-awareness can take on all these different forms, all these tactics. So commit yourself to the process of working on self-judgment. Expect that it will take however long it takes, right? And expect it to change. Expect the elements within that process to change. And put in some curiosity, right? Instead of every single time that a tactic stops working, saying, oh, I failed. Obviously, I failed because this didn't work and I found another thing that failed. Get curious about, oh, okay, this doesn't work anymore. What does work right now? What do I need right now? If meditating isn't what I need right now, what do I need right now? If talking to a person about how I feel that it is not what I need right now, what do I need right now? Or maybe I try to just journal and cry and then I don't actually feel better. That's interesting. There's still all these bricks on top of me, even though I have just journaled and cried. That's interesting. Maybe there's something else that I can do. What else can I do? Why would that be happening? And notice how that is the compassionate response, while you could easily, in working on unloading your self-judgment, you could cry, you could journal, and then if that doesn't work, you could just so easily plunge back into the self-judgment and say, well, why didn't that work? Like, obviously, I don't know what's good for me, and obviously, I don't know what I'm doing. So important is to get curious. So when something stops working, expect that. Expect all the tactics to stop working at some point. And when they don't, get curious. Oh, that's interesting. That didn't work right now. Okay? Like crying was not enough. Is it because I cried alone? Do I feel like I need someone else there while I cry right now? Do I need somebody to be there for me? That's really interesting. Okay? And maybe you reach out to somebody. Maybe, they give you space to cry. Maybe that makes you feel better. And then oh, okay, that's really interesting. That's what I needed then. Okay, now I know. But maybe next time, you cry, you go to somebody, they help you cry, it doesn't help. Wow, that's really interesting. It worked last week. It doesn't work this week. What does that mean? What do I need right now? What do I need? And by constantly putting the focus on experimentation, curiosity, compassionate responding, then you give yourself this space to change constantly, not to change in this, I used to be a self-judging person and now I'm happy. I used to be this person that was just really miserable and now I'm always good. No, that change happens moment to moment. Okay, it happens every day. We go through them all the time, right? Like we think we know what we need and then we don't. The answers change. They change constantly. Okay, the most important thing is to keep asking the question. Okay, the answers are going to change. It's the questions that are important. Commit to the questions. Okay, am I judging myself right now? Oh, am I doing that thing again? Oh, okay. Well, what do I need right now? How can I put this brick down? How can I be compassionate right now? What do I need? Okay, and by focusing on those questions, in the long run, you will develop these processes that really work for you. Let's talk about tips and tricks. Now that we know that tips and tricks are interchangeable, then knowing that we can take it with a grain of salt, right? So that's why we talked about how to set up the coping framework before we talked about the tactics. So everything that's about to follow are things that I've used, and my clients have used, maybe I've heard of people using, is by no means an exclusive list of things that are possible, and it's not all going to be effective for you. Even the things that I say are effective for me now might not be effective for me next week. So I hope that these are helpful to you and that you constantly keep in mind that it's okay for these to change. It could be a good idea today, maybe not a good idea tomorrow. And I'm going to try to break them up to make it a little more consumable into the 7 guidelines. So give you a few tactics for each one of the 7. Let's get started with the first one, identifying self-judgment as the problem. Something that I find is really useful for me is to give that voice a character. and personify it in some sort of way. I've seen this work for many people. Sometimes it works when you actually trace where the voice came from, who you learned it from. Maybe it's a relative, maybe it's an ex, who knows, and you insert this personality onto the voice so that you can separate a little bit from it, so that when you see it coming, you can say, oh, it's you again, and you can hear the voice as a voice as opposed to unconditionally accepting it as true. A great way to separate from the voice as well is to think of somebody that you know is neurotic, somebody that maybe you don't trust very much with giving you advice on things. So, for example, let's say that there's a relative every time that you go to a family reunion, and there's a relative who always gives you advice on your life, but you know they don't know you. They're coping with many things themselves. Maybe you don't really feel like this person is in a place to give you sound advice, so you appreciate the kind gesture of caring, but there's no way that you're going to possibly take this person's advice. So it's really useful to make that personality stick to the self-judging voice in your head, because you already have a relationship with that kind of personality, right? So when you see it like that, you immediately just separate. I've heard of an unusual amount of people that I've worked with have made that voice their boss. So I don't know what that's all about. So if that's helpful to you, then for sure use it. You could also thank the voice, because remember, it is trying to help you. It's this really natural outgrowth of being hurt. When you were a kid, you didn't have this self-judgment reflex, but the self-judgment reflex came essentially from your mind trying to protect you from pain, which at the end of the day is pretty sweet. It's a nice thing to try to do. Your mind's trying to protect you. It's just protecting you in such a way that it's throttling you and taking away all of your freedom. So saying thank you can actually make such a difference, because I don't know about you, but for me to ignore my mind and sort of just listen to my thoughts, that's not always possible. Sometimes it's been yelling, like screaming at the top of its lungs, and it's hard to ignore. And in order to make it to that place of peace, I have to acknowledge the fact that my mind is saying something to me and say, you know what, thank you. I recognize that you are trying to help me, but I've got it. Okay. And then sometimes I actually tell it to go to bed. Like, you know what, you're stressed out. I picture my mind as a stressed out office worker that's taking on all of these tasks, always make Veronika happy and always make her look good in front of everybody, always, and they're just these really unreasonable perfectionist thoughts. And if I accidentally believe too many of them, then my mind's really working very hard to fulfill those perfectionist standards. So I say, you know what? Thank you. Thank you for trying to fulfill those standards that I accidentally set. Thank you for trying to protect me, but I've got it. Okay, you can go to bed. And I think you have to be ready at that point for your mind to actually go to bed, because sometimes I've done that exercise where I've recognized the self-judgment, I've recognized it, getting really anxious and getting really overbearing. I've said, you know what, thank you. Thank you so much for trying to protect me, but just take a break. I've got it. And then I found myself really unable to perform basic tasks because my mind says, you want me to go to bed? I'll go to bed. So I think it's pretty safe to arrange a session of, yoga or meditation or just something calm after you do that. Because if it actually works, you don't want to be driving a car or anything like that. And for the last kind of trick to identify the self-judgment as a problem is saying it out loud. And the first time I heard anything like this, I think it was from Brene Brown, and she said, when you're experiencing shame, just say it out loud. Just say shame, shame, shame. And I thought this was sort of silly at first, but I've practiced this a few times where I'll be really hurt, or I'll be very anxious, or I'll be, stuck in these emotions, and then I'll find the self-judgment in there. And then I'll say it out loud, and I'll say, wow, you're being really hard on yourself right now. You're really judging yourself. And something about saying it out loud, even if it's just to myself, it just makes it more real. It makes it easier to come back to what we know the actual problem is. Okay? So let's move on to how can we expect self-judgment, because that's guideline number 2, right? To expect it, to expect reality. So some tactics to help us out with that. Something that I do in my own, and I think I've mentioned this already in the video, is that I set this kind of expected threshold, depending on how I'm doing, right? Where I am in my journey, I now expect a certain amount of self-judgment at a certain time. So after making these videos, then, maybe it's 5 minutes, maybe it's 10 minutes, maybe it's 15 minutes, maybe after meeting a new one person, right? Maybe I'll give myself 5-10 minutes. But if I've just done, oh, by the way, I should just mention, we're staying at an Airbnb place and they've got kids. So if you hear screaming, don't worry. So when there are these different situations, let's say that I go and I speak on a stage for an hour and there are maybe 100 people there. That's going to feel really good, right, in the moment. But then when I walk away from it, there might be this slowly ebbing energy. And in that energy, there's this danger zone, right? And for me to expect anything different would just be unreasonable, right? Because as your energy goes up, when you spend time with people, a lot of people for a long time, there's going to be the same energy coming back down. That's life, right? There's ebbs and flows. So I will determine a reasonable kind of amount of time that maybe I could be judging myself after a situation. And sometimes I surprise myself, right? Sometimes it's so much shorter than I thought it would be. And sometimes I also surprise myself because I'll be with a person who I know very well, with whom I feel pretty vulnerable, pretty comfortable. And afterwards, I'll just get this incredibly powerful self-judging reaction that just hurts so much. And I just wonder, wow, where did this come from? So it's not a foolproof tactic, of course. But if you expect it to come and then maybe give it a time that you think is pretty reasonable, then you can be very patient with yourself, right? It's a type of self-awareness where you learn how to react to yourself. And, I'm not perfect at this. I can't reliably predict how long I'll experience self-judgment after each and every situation. But if you can start to try to do that, to predict what's going to happen in the future, then I think you get this feedback that says, oh, okay, you were right or you were wrong. This is how you can do it better next time, right? And then you can expect reality in a more realistic way by continuing to get feedback on that, right? You could also arrange to, in that time, because if you're expecting that time, let's say you do something that, it'll be really scary. Let's say you go to a meetup and you speak about some really vulnerable experiences out of your past and okay, that's going to come with this going down back ebb and flow sequence, right? So you could arrange to, okay, I'm going to go to the meetup, but you know what? Right after that, I'm going to go to this yoga class, or I'm going to go to my massage therapist, or, right after I get off this call that's really difficult for me, right away, I've got it planned. I'm going to go take a hot bath. I'm going to go read a book, right? Or maybe after I go on this date, right afterwards, I'm just going to go and I'm going to do some yoga, I'm going to meditate, I'm going to relax, right? So if you've got things planned out that way, then you can really be gentle with yourself, because I think a lot of the time the problem with how we arrange these situations is just about scheduling, right? Like we do something that's really scary for us, and then after that we have arranged to do some sort of really busy work, really intense work where we can't really calm down. So now we've just gone up and we need the space to come back down. But if we're doing something that forces us to keep going, even if it's drinking a cup of coffee, or if you've planned to do some more social interaction right after that, and right, it doesn't go up and up and up for you. You need to have a social interaction, come back down, have another one, come back down. If you work directly against the patterns that work for you, then that's going to hurt. But if you plan your day, and if you plan those moments, those vulnerable moments, in such a way where you can always recover, then you will give yourself the space to recover, right? So I hope that you can find a way to do that serves you, that serves your schedule and your life. Now let's talk about how do we not let it stop us, because I think that one's pretty hard, and it's something that I focus on doing as much as I can, and kind of a magical way to make sure that your self-judgment does not stop you from getting into these essential situations that you need to be happy, right? I mean, you need to be vulnerable. You need to be around people. You just need to, right? Like, you're a human being. These are basic needs. One of the ways to not let it stop you in the moment is to actively seek out opportunities to be in those situations. And it sounds so scary. Once you pick some of these situations out and you do it, on the other side, there's such a release, right? Like, one example, I don't know if you've seen this video. I made a video when we were just coming back from Mexico, and we were staying there for 3 months, no air conditioning, just living in the local part of town. And when we were coming back, the air conditioning, it really hit my skin. I have very sensitive skin, and it hit me really hard. And I got all these cold sores on my face, and it triggered the shame within me that I've felt since I was a kid, about having those cold sores on my face. So instead of going and hiding like I wanted to and just waiting until my face looked better, I just said, I'm going to make a video. And that was very hard. It was very hard to decide to say, oh my gosh, my head is full of judgment right now, and I'm going to make a video about this. But on the other side of keeping in mind, that I'm not the only one that goes through this, and also keeping in mind how good it's going to feel for me, how good it's going to feel for others if I show up and I let myself be seen. I don't let self-judgment stop me, how helpful that's going to be to me and others. I keep that in mind, and then on the other side, it feels so good, right? Even by the end of the video, I felt better. When I was taping even this video, right? I'm doing this over the course of 2 days, but yesterday, I woke up with a pimple. I could have easily said, okay, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it just because of that. But it seems so innocent, right? It just seems so innocent. I'm not gonna go on camera because I got a pimple. I can wait. I do have a clear face sometimes, right? So I can wait for that because, I don't wear makeup, so I just wait for it. But then, you learn, you affirm this thing to yourself. Like, no, it's not okay to go on camera if you have a pimple. No, it's not okay to be seen. And it seems so harmless in the moment, but I've learned, just from paying attention to these cycles, every time you listen to it, it just gets stronger. And then you wake up the next day and then you're judging something else. And then it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So there's these in the moment ways that you can say, okay, no, I'm just going to do it. You look for those opportunities. But to get into the habit of it, it's so helpful to actively seek out those opportunities. Okay, at what times is my self-judgment really strong? Is it really strong if I, for example, come up and say hello to a new person? Just hello to a person on the street. Just say hi and smile. Do I go wild in my head about that? Okay, so how can I do that? Right? How can I take some of these fears that I have and then just plunge myself right into them, and realizing that if I can just enter that situation, right, and just try to get into it as fast as I can, so I don't give myself time to judge myself beforehand, don't give myself time to judge in the moment, then I'm stuck with, judging myself afterward. But that's progress, right? Instead of having it embedded in all the parts of the process, now you're just dealing with it afterwards. You can make that safe space. You can be gentle with yourself, right? You can expect that. And the more that you can practice that, the better that's going to feel, okay? Another way that you can facilitate this for yourself is to have a mantra in the moment, okay? Because when you get triggered and you just want to run away, if you've already come into it and you're coming into it before, you're saying, oh no, this is going to be terrible. It's going to be this horrible thing. I'm just going to screw it all up. It's going to be so bad. And then you get into that moment and you're frozen, totally frozen with fear. Your blinders are on, you're right in the emotion. The only thing that's really going to help get you out is pulling yourself out by yourself, right? Pulling yourself out repetitively, constantly. And of course, there's this pattern of repetition. The more you do it over the month, over the year, over your lifetime, the easier it's going to get. But also, the more times that you repeat yourself some sort of mantra or some sort of thing that you say to yourself in the moment, the easier it is going to get in the moment to not run away, right? So something that I used to use, a mantra that was really good for me, was "You are strong and beautiful." And I would just, anytime that I was triggered, I would just go and I would run into the bathroom. I would just say that to myself over and over and over. And sometimes it made me cry. Sometimes it turned me into this big mess. But then I didn't run from the things that were coming up for me, because it's so hard, once you start dealing with the first layer of self-judgment, it just skews to something else, and then something else, and then something else. And you get used to experiencing the manifestation of self-judgment that you are dealing with right now. But the more you deal with this pattern, it comes back to the way that you used to judge yourself when you were a kid, and the way that other people have judged you is harsh. It gets pretty harsh sometimes. So having this mantra is kind of like this rock that you hold in your hand, just like something safe that holds you on, right? Like a constant. It's a movie reference, I don't know if you'll get, but you hold on to it, and it keeps you through all of these situations, just brings you back to center. It reminds you, okay, it's okay, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it. Whatever the mantra is, that's what the mantra that you can use. And those mantras too, expect those to change. I mean, one that was really, really good for me for a long time was, you are immortal. It's just so good. It really worked so powerfully, and I liked it so much. And then, it faded away, right? It lasted for as long as it lasted, and then I had to use something else. Another mantra that I used was, you are nature. I just remember when that hit me so powerfully. It was so good. I mean, it just reminded me of how I'm ever changing, how I'm interconnected, how I'm always growing, how I'm part of everything. It's okay to live and die. Everything's always going to be okay. And I would look at nature, and I would really experience it so powerfully, like, wow, I am nature. And I have internalized this now. I mean, I do feel like that around nature, but it's no longer this honeymoon period where I'm so passionate about it, right? And I might have another mantra in another moment, another mantra in another one. Sometimes, like right now, my mantra is just, it's okay. It doesn't sound like a very powerful mantra, and I don't really say it with as much passion that I've said the other ones, but it's working for me right now. And maybe even by the time you're watching this, that's not going to be the mantra anymore. So whatever the mantra is that will help you not run away, help you stay in that situation, right? That's what the mantra's got to be, right? You just work with whatever you've got. Now let's move on to, how do we add compassion instead of trying to, make the judgment go away? And this is interesting because it's a bit like doing the first one, right? When you want to identify self-judgment as the problem, it really helps to make it into a person, personify it in your head, right? And when you want to add self-compassion, that also really helps to make that voice, that self-compassionate voice, into a person in your head, and invite them to that conversation, right? Because once there's this self-judging part of you, there's also this self-loving part of you, and they're both just mental patterns, right? But to allow that self-compassionate pattern to exist, right, to give it a voice, to give it a personality, just think of, what personality would you give it, right? Like, who do you know that's like that? Who do you know in your life that's like that? A movie character, a TV character, an archetype. Who reminds you of this compassionate way that you speak to yourself? Or maybe it's you. I've worked with people who it was their higher self, and they kind of had this image of that inside of their head, right? This is just the higher self of theirs, speaking to them in this warm, compassionate tone. Maybe it's your mother. Maybe it's the mother that you felt like you never had. Maybe it's Mother Earth. Maybe it's an entity, right? Whatever it is, just personify that voice so that when you're adding the self-compassion, you can really feel the embrace of this personality within you. And something else that could really help is allowing those two voices to speak to each other. Like, I know this sounds like insanity, but really I think that it is the bridge to sanity, right? If somebody's got all of these voices inside of their head and the voices don't agree, then that person could get into a lot of suffering. But if you get this self-judging voice and this self-compassionate voice in your head, you really facilitate that conversation in a journal, for example. You can do something like write out what the self-judgment is saying, so you can separate from the voice, skip a line, write out what your self-compassionate voice says. And as you witness this conversation, there's this amazing way that they learn to speak to one another. I mean, that's one thing. But I think just automatically, you realize that you are the person watching this conversation. And that's really the beautiful thing about personifying those mental patterns, is that you as a side effect, really, you reinforce your identity as this watcher of the thoughts, as not someone who's defined by those thoughts, but somebody who watches them, and then somebody that can choose whom to believe in any given moment, right? Another way to make that compassionate voice stronger, really, to identify it more, is to take a time of clarity. Maybe you're in a time of clarity right now watching this video, or maybe right after this video, and you feel as if you really know what you have to do, right? Oh, okay, I really feel this idea of being curious about myself, of loving myself, being compassionate to myself, of seeing the self-judgment as this toxic mental pattern that's going on in my head, that I can easily sway towards self-awareness. I can do this. This is really good for me, and I can do it. It's a journey. While you're in that state, you have the power to find out what you really feel in that state by, for example, writing a letter from your most compassionate, clear self to yourself when you're triggered, when you're really in that self-judging place. And imagine how powerful that can be, because those are your words. Those are your words, your frameworks, your concepts, your personal understandings. And it's going to be so much more effective for you to hear the way that you speak in a compassionate state of mind than to hear someone else speak, because you know what you need to hear. If you come from this point of view of, okay, what have I always wanted somebody to say to me when I'm in that state, right? Like, imagine when you're supporting someone, if you could just open their brain and see these phrases, these words, these triggers that it would take to make them feel better. Well, you've got that information about yourself, right? It all comes down to the fact that when you're triggered into self-judgment, you've got the blinders on. It's like you can't see anything else. And when you're clear, it's almost like you forget the self-judgment even exists, and you fear going there. Well, what if you were to help those two states acknowledge one another? When you're feeling your most compassionate self, write a letter to yourself in your self-judging state. When you're being really judgmental to yourself and you're right in there in that emotional toxic thought pattern, you're about to do all these things you usually do, then you can pull out and reach towards your compassionate self. So it's not like you have to be either or, right? You can facilitate this conversation between them, right? And once again, there's so many ways to do that, right? Like, these are just tactics that I've seen work, tactics that I suggest to people. But if you can think of some other way to, okay, here's how I can add compassion, how I can strengthen that compassionate voice. Maybe you want to speak it into a voice recorder. Maybe you want to make a fun video. Maybe you want to make a PowerPoint presentation, whatever comes to your mind. That's it, right? Like, that's your tactic. And if you think that it'll work, then you should try it. Okay. Now, talking about how to provide a safe space for your emotions to come out, right? Because that was guideline number 5. Create that safe space for yourself, whether it's by yourself, with others. Some ways to provide yourself with a safe space by yourself. One of my favorites is journaling. You just get a pen and you just say all the things. And often, especially if it's about someone else, if I'm really angry or if I'm really upset and I'm in the always never kind of really triggered state, then I can write that and give myself freedom to write that. Or I feel like this about myself, like this about this person, and get it all out. And then you can just rip it out and burn it, right? Or you can rip it out and tear it up and throw it away. You don't have to keep these pieces of yourself. I mean, if you want to, then you can, but that's a really great way to kind of release it. You put it down on paper and then it's gone. Another way that you could do it is through mirror work. You can speak to yourself right there. You see your own reaction. You can cry with yourself. You can be there with yourself. I mean, I know it sounds a little silly if you've never seen it or experienced it, but I've had such powerful moments of healing with myself, just with those eyes, that person that will be there with me, will cry with me, that I can say, I'm here unconditionally. I will be here for as long as it takes. And it's so powerful. It's so much more powerful than anyone else, because with someone else, you can wonder, but will you, right? But if you commit 100%, I will be there for this person, and you come out to the mirror and you tell yourself that I am here, it's so powerful. You can really, really feel that. So maybe that will be right for you. You can also, as I said, you can journal the two voices, so not just venting, right? You can vent, and then you can provide yourself with some of that self-compassion. It also, you can do something physical, right? Like maybe for you, a physical safe space is when you're just surrounded by blankets and pillows, right? Maybe you need to get into your bed and just cover yourself with really comfy things. Maybe you need to crawl into your closet and put some pillows around yourself. Maybe you need to listen to some soothing music and provide that. Maybe you need to go in the shower. Maybe there's something about showering or taking a really hot bath or taking a really hot shower that really helps you cleanse through that energy. Maybe doing yoga and doing some intense breathing. Maybe that is the safe space that you need. Maybe meditation is the safe space you need. Maybe you need to sing or laugh. I'm always so amazed by people that can release their sadness or their anger through laughter, and they purposefully go, there's laughter meditation, but then there's also people who when they're feeling emotionally overwhelmed, they go and they go watch something funny, or they go and call somebody up that makes them laugh, or go to a stand-up comedy show, because that's how they choose to release their emotion. Like, that's also giving yourself a safe space, and I just think that's an incredible way to reroute it, right? You could also create that safe space with others. And this is something that, it's so important to set this up outside of the moment of being triggered, because I think there's so often that we wait until we're covered in those bricks, and then we just got to throw them off right away. And then we reach out to a person. We don't know if we can trust them. We haven't talked to them about the fact that we need a safe space. We haven't talked to them about the fact that we're going through something. We're going through this period of self-judgment and really need someone to be there. And even if that person was 100% willing to be there for us, right? You call them up and then you just flood them over with all of your emotions, and then they kind of lean back just because, they were going on with their life. They don't know why this is happening. Like, it's so sudden for them. It wasn't not planned, and then we just feel rejected, and then the self-judgment is worse. And it's so easy to assume that that person will not be supportive for us. And, sometimes it's true, but other times it's just about being prepared, right? So make sure in a time of clarity that you really think about, okay, how will I provide myself with that safe space? Am I going to try to do it on my own? Okay. How will I know that I actually need somebody to help me out in the first little bit? And how will I arrange for that outside of that? And there's so many ways, right? There are group therapy. There are groups. Even the love tribes, maybe you're in a love tribe. That's a free online community where you can go and take a safe space. But, maybe typing's not enough for you. Maybe you need to meet up with a person. Maybe you call up someone from the love tribe and then get together with them. Maybe you go to a support group. Maybe you go to a therapist, a counselor, a life coach. There's so many different options available. Some of them are free, some of them are paid, some of them, you do with friends and family. And that kind of framework where you say, okay, I'm going to do what's right for me, it gives you this power to say, I deserve to have the safe space that feels the safest for me, as opposed to the one that is the most available, right? Or the one that will be the most acceptable among people that I speak to, right? Like, if a space feels safe to you, then that's all that matters. And you can experiment with this. You can try out different ones. If you go, I think people have a tendency of, especially when you're really deep into self-judgment, you go and you try to reach out for help in a certain way, and maybe the life coach or the therapist, they're just not right for you, but then you hold on because you say, oh, that means there's something wrong with me, right? That means there's something wrong with me because I'm not reacting to this person. This person's got such good qualifications. They're so popular, or they're so expensive. So it should be working. So if it's not working, it's my fault. Forget all that. The most important thing with creating a safe space is that it feels right for you. Nobody is broken enough that there's no safe space anywhere for them, right? Being broken like that is just an illusion. And there's a safe space out there for everybody, okay? You just gotta have that faith. You gotta keep experimenting. You gotta look for it, set it up outside of the time, and just trust that if you haven't found this way where you feel safe expressing your emotions, then you just haven't found the right place yet. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be uncomfortable, okay? So don't look for the perfect place that always makes you feel good always, but just safe, as in your emotions do begin to come out, even though there's fear, even though there's self-judgment, even though maybe you think, okay, can I trust this person or these people? Can I trust myself? Over time, that trust builds, okay? And so if that's what you found, that's your safe space. If you haven't, keep looking. It's okay to keep looking. And let's talk about now identifying your crutches. So I think this one's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, it seems that the crutches are tactics within themselves, so it's going to be really different for everybody to try to identify the way, okay, how do I run away from doing this independently one day? How do I run away from doing that? What do I depend on? And maybe for you, it's just so easy because it's so obvious. If you have a vice that you've thought about and that you have some guilt about, maybe then okay, that's the vice that I go to. But maybe when you identify those crutches, right, which maybe you don't need a tactic to do, maybe actually stopping relying on them is really difficult. And I think that's very common, especially if you've been depending on them for a long time. So something that I've seen work pretty effectively is bringing presence to the crutch as opposed to trying to get rid of it right away. Now, this is something that I first learned about in this book called The Easy Way to Quit Smoking, which was actually, it was the thing that pushed me over the edge that helped me quit smoking years ago. There's also a book by Charles Eisenstein called The Yoga of Eating. These are amazing, amazing books in that they trust the body and they say, if you're smoking too much, eating the wrong things, if you're doing these things that are bad for you, you really have to go into a trance. You really have to check out of reality in order to do that. So in order to bring us back to trusting our bodies, why don't we bring some presence into that behavior, right? Because if you're using, let's use smoking as an example. If you're using smoking as a crutch to manage your emotions, right, then every time that you smoke, you kind of check out from your emotions and you say goodbye to them. But what if you were to be really present with that cigarette? What if you were to taste it, inhale it, really be present with that experience, which would not be very pleasant as soon as you start experiencing the presence of it? You also couldn't check out of your emotions while you're doing it too, right? So to stop the trance-like effect of all your vices, right? Because that's what they're doing. They're putting you in this trance and then you just don't notice that you've got the bricks on you, right? Then presence helps you come back to, okay, you know what? Not only do I still have these bricks on me, but this vice actually feels really bad. Overeating actually feels really bad, or smoking actually feels really bad, or drinking, it feels bad. It feels, while they're doing it, and then the next morning, it really get present with that process. And then it becomes less of a battle of willpower, like, oh, I'm going to get rid of my crutches that I use for emotional regulation. And then it becomes more this process of wanting things that are good for you and to slowly stop wanting things that are bad for you, and to trust, once again, it all comes back to trust, right? Like, trust that this is the way that you're naturally wired. Okay, and trying to go back to that natural order of things where your body knows what's good for you, right? Where you're not going into trances and telling yourself stories about what's good for you. You're really experiencing what's good for you, what's bad for you right now, what's good for you right now, right? And for our last one, experimenting, being curious, expecting the answers to change. This is, it's hard. It's hard because, what can you do? You can come up with a way to remind yourself, right? You can come up with, and for all of the guidelines, you can make a desktop wallpaper that reminds you of it. You can make a mantra that reminds you of it. You can put a bulletin on your wall that says, okay, remember, self-judgment is the problem. The answers will change, right? And then it feels so good. But then a week goes by and it's not helpful anymore. So it's funny because reminding yourself of the ever-changing impermanent nature of the answers, of the tactics, of even the tactics that maybe you've heard me say some in this section, and you said, oh, okay, I really want to try that. That will really work. Accepting the impermanent nature of them, you can forget that. So how do you remind yourself of the impermanent nature of things? And well, first of all, practice is really important. And the other thing is that if you try to experiment with frameworks that you already know, or try to draw upon knowledge that you already have within you, if you try to draw upon this understanding that you have in another area of your life, then it becomes so much easier to bring it to another area of your life, right? So, for example, I always use the metaphor of your favorite song. So your favorite song throughout time is going to change, but you don't change the fact that you listen to music, right? You can keep listening to those songs, keep listening to the radio, keep buying CDs, but the actual favorite song is going to change. So when I think of that framework and I apply it to the process of searching for answers to my self-judgment, if I ever start getting really frustrated that a certain tactic isn't working, I think of that framework and I say, okay, well, what's another framework that could work, right? And think, I wouldn't judge myself for not liking a certain food anymore, not liking a certain song. I love to cook, and sometimes I just get sick of certain flavors. I don't judge myself for that. I don't say, oh, well, what's wrong with me that I don't want to eat udon anymore, right? I just say, okay, well, what do I want to eat, right? And if you can find some of these frameworks that you already have, right? Like, in what areas of your life do you already accept the fact that questions are more important than answers, right? Then you will begin to kind of take that framework on in this area too, because you're already doing it somewhere. You're already doing it. And finally, just doing all of these things, experimenting with them will help you experiment. That makes sense. But the more that you kind of play with the things that I've talked about here and not just write down, these are the things Veronika said to do, so I'm going to do them. Think of your own ideas and then experiment with them and see how they feel. The more that you experiment, the more that you will learn to experiment, right? The more that you play with the tactics, the more that you will learn to play with the tactics. The more that you rely on asking that question and having the answers be whatever they are, the more frequently you do that, the more frequently you will be able to do that. So remember, it's just about practice, right? It all comes down to practice and trust and coming back to, okay, this is a journey. This is a journey that I'm on, right? And no matter how it looks right now, in the grand scheme of things, I'm progressing. But you know what? In the grand scheme of things too, I'm playing, right? I'm experimenting, I'm playing, and it's not as serious, right? It's not as serious as I have this malignant thing going on and I just have to fix it right now, right? If you can just see it as something that you're going to do for the rest of your life, like cooking, like playing, like listening to music, and it's okay for things to come and go, I think it'll give you this feeling of relief, like, oh, okay, it's okay to experiment. Right. So I hope that those have been helpful to you. And please, if you're writing things down right now, write down your own ideas too. It's so important. It's so important that you see yourself as an expert on this, that you see your own tactics, your own tools, your own ideas as valuable, right? Like, just think of how if you have a thought, if you're the kind of person, you get a thought and you're like, oh no, that doesn't sound good. But if it were to come out of my mouth or somebody else's mouth, you're like, oh, okay, that's good. Then notice that. Right? That's a kind of self-judgment too. If you've gotten ideas for things that you could do, but you said, oh, maybe that's stupid. No, it's not stupid. Write it down, try it. It might just work. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our journey into self-judgment for today. I hope that this has been helpful to you. I hope you've had a few aha moments and maybe have written down some ideas of things that you'd like to try, maybe things that you think would help in your journey. And I know we've covered a lot in this time, and I hope that if there's anything that you really walk away with, it's this idea that self-judgment is what you're up against and that self-awareness is what you're trying to build, right? And if you can just see it that way, that self-judgment is just this thing, it's going to keep happening. It keeps happening to all of us, and it's something that we're up against the same way that you're up against hunger all the time. Like, it comes back to you 3 times a day. You're up against self-judgment, right? And in the same way that you cultivate nourishing habits for yourself every single day, that you have the opportunity to eat every day, you have the opportunity to practice self-awareness, self-compassionate self-awareness every single day. And that it's not about fixing what's broken, and then that's it. It's really about embarking on this lifelong journey of experimentation and curiosity and building new patterns, seeing things in a new way, seeing yourself in a new way, and being ready to discard the answers of yesterday and take on the answers of today and be ready for those answers to change tomorrow. And I think that's the ultimate freedom, the freedom to be free of having to rely on those tactics, to rely on those fixes, and to really learn how to do it yourself, to really learn how your own mind works, to learn how your emotions work, to learn about the sources of your own suffering, and begin to figure out how to do it yourself, and realize that you are this amazing expert on yourself. You have so much more information about you than anyone else could possibly have. No matter how long they've gone to school, no matter how experienced they are, you have more information to work with, right? But right now it's just, maybe it's unprocessed and you haven't really started to draw those parallels, those patterns, or maybe you have started and you feel like you've hit a wall, but it doesn't mean that you've hit a wall with your abilities, right? Maybe you've just hit a wall in trying to arrange these ideas and these patterns that you see into something that can really help you, into something that can really serve you in the long run, into something that you can process. But it doesn't mean that you don't have that capacity, okay? You have just as much capacity, if not more, than anyone else to take hold of your own journey of self-awareness, of self-judgment, right? It's up to you. And I think that's really the beautiful thing, once you realize how much opportunity there is in every single moment for you to build those nourishing habits with yourself and to develop different ways of responding to yourself. And it really becomes about building a relationship, right? It comes down to this lifelong relationship with yourself where you commit to having these conversations, the hard conversations, the good conversations, and you commit to doing it and just showing up, right? And taking whatever comes on the way as it's going to come. So I hope that, you take some time right now, maybe to debrief, right? Maybe journal a bit, figure out, okay, are there still questions that I have for myself, or maybe you have questions for me, or maybe you have some comments. I encourage you to send me your questions. I encourage you to leave a comment here. Let me know what you thought, if there was something that you feel that you'd like more information on, or if there's something that you had an epiphany about that you'd like to share. If you want to share with people in your life, if you want to talk about this, use this video as a springboard for, okay, let's have a conversation about creating these safe spaces for each other. That can be such a beautiful thing, right? And really, I want to know what you want to know about, because this video, it really originated from this place of people asking for it. So the more that you let me know what you want to hear about, if there are other people that want to hear about it, or if I feel particularly passionate about sharing that, then there's a much better chance that we can sit down here and have these conversations together, because this is good. It's good for you and it's good for me too. It's really good for me to process through all these cases that I've seen of people working through self-judgment and what that looks like, because sometimes if I work with people one-on-one, then I see their stories, I see my story, and sometimes it gets a little segmented in my head. But when I'm asked to draw some parallels and give kind of a holistic explanation of what I'm really seeing here and what I'm really interacting with, it's incredibly helpful to me as well. So I'd really like for this to be an interactive process, right? Because I'm not, just some expert guru who knows what to say anytime. I'm just another person on this journey, just like you. We're walking together, and I'm just sharing what I see. And I encourage you to share what you see, and let me know how you're doing and how this is affecting your life, right? And before we go, I just really want to encourage you, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel, leave me a comment, let me know how it was. It really makes a difference. Okay. Well, thank you. And until next time, bye-bye.